Before this story begins, understand this. What you're about to hear was never written down, never ordered out loud, and never meant to be exposed. These decisions happened in silence, around tables that looked ordinary but weren't. If you want to understand how power really works, stay with me until the end. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and come back for every chapter, because this story doesn't end with one execution. It ends with a system that's still alive. The table was never meant to be a place of power. In its most ordinary form, it exists to bring people together, food passed hand to hand, stories repeated until they lose their edges, silence broken by routine. But in certain families, in certain worlds that exist parallel to law and visibility, the table becomes something else entirely. It becomes a courtroom without records, a parliament without votes, an execution chamber without blood on the floor. This is where decisions are made that will never appear in documents, never be signed, never be denied outright, because they were never spoken clearly enough to be traced. At this table, no one says the word execute. They don't need to. Language here is economical, coded, almost polite. Someone mentions a problem that's growing. Someone else asks how long it's been tolerated. A third person sighs, slowly, as if tired of repeating the same lesson. The power of the table is not in the volume of speech, but in the shared understanding that some outcomes are inevitable once certain topics are raised. When the conversation ends, nothing appears to have happened. Plates are cleared, chairs scrape softly against the floor, and yet, somewhere beyond the walls of that room, a life has already been placed on borrowed time. What makes the family table so effective is precisely what makes it invisible. There are no official roles assigned. No one wears a uniform. Authority doesn't announce itself, it reveals itself through habit. Who speaks first? Who interrupts without consequence? Who everyone looks at when silence stretches too long? In many documented criminal structures, investigators initially searched for written orders, phone calls, recorded meetings, anything resembling a traditional chain of command. What they eventually learned was that the real decisions had already been made long before those mechanisms were activated. The table didn't issue orders, it created certainty, and certainty is far more powerful than instruction. This is why responsibility becomes so difficult to isolate. If no one explicitly said, "Do it," then who authorized it? The genius and the cruelty of the family table lies in its collective nature. Each participant contributes just enough to push the decision forward while retaining plausible innocence. One raises the concern, another confirms the risk. A third reminds the group of what happened the last time a similar situation was ignored. No one crosses the line alone, but together they step over it without ever acknowledging the boundary. Later, when the consequences unfold, each person can point to the others or to the silence itself as proof that nothing definitive was decided. For outsiders, this structure is almost impossible to comprehend. Modern systems of justice are built on explicit authorization. Someone signs something. Someone gives a direct command. Someone can be named. The family table rejects this logic entirely. It operates on shared memory and mutual fear. Everyone remembers what happens when problems are allowed to linger. Everyone remembers the stories of weakness punished more harshly than defiance. These memories don't need to be spoken aloud. They sit at the table like an invisible elder, watching, reminding, guiding the outcome. In many cases, the youngest people at the table learn this before they are ever told. Children grow up listening to conversations that sound ordinary on the surface, but carry a subtext they slowly learn to decode. They learn which names are spoken carefully, which topics cause voices to drop, which absences are never explained. Over time, violence becomes abstract, then procedural, then normalized. By the time they are old enough to participate, they don't ask why certain things must happen. They only ask whether now is the right moment, What makes this power structure especially dangerous is that it doesn't rely on charisma or force alone. It relies on belonging. To sit at the table is to be part of something that promises protection, identity, and continuity. But belonging comes with a price. Once you are inside, neutrality is no longer an option. Silence becomes agreement. Presence becomes endorsement. Even discomfort becomes irrelevant, because leaving the table, physically or symbolically, can be interpreted as betrayal. In this way, the family table doesn't just authorize executions, it manufactures consent long before the decision is made. Investigators and journalists who have managed to reconstruct these moments often describe the same pattern. After an execution, rumors circulate about who ordered it. The visible leader denies involvement. The enforcers claim they were acting on understanding. Family members insist no such conversation ever took place, and technically they are all telling the truth. There was no order in the conventional sense. There was only alignment, a shared conclusion reached without the inconvenience of accountability. This system also protects those at the center from direct exposure. If law enforcement pressures one individual, that person can truthfully say they never gave the order. And they didn't. They didn't have to. The table did the work for them. It distributed the decision across multiple voices, multiple silences, multiple gestures. The result is a form of power that is both absolute and elusive, capable of ending lives while remaining legally intangible. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the family table is how ordinary it looks. There are no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices, no theatrical threats. Just routine, repetition, and an unspoken understanding that some problems require permanent solutions. The violence occurs elsewhere, carried out by people who may never have sat at that table, but who are bound to it by loyalty and fear. By the time they act, the moral weight has already been lifted from them. They are not deciding, they are executing a conclusion reached long ago, and so the table remains. Night after night, meal after meal. Its surface bears no marks of what it authorizes. No stains, no records, just the quiet confidence of a system that knows it doesn't need to announce its power to exercise it. Because in this world, the most dangerous decisions are not the ones shouted from rooftops, but the ones agreed upon softly, over dinner by people who will later insist that nothing was ever decided at all. Power is often imagined as something visible, a single figure at the top, issuing commands feared and obeyed. In documentaries, in headlines, in courtroom narratives, the story is usually simplified around a boss, a leader, a name that can be photographed, indicted, or killed. But this image collapses the moment you look closely at how executions were actually authorized. Again and again, investigations revealed an uncomfortable truth. The person with the title was not always the person in control. Rank mattered far less than blood. Inside families that functioned as power structures, hierarchy was emotional before it was organizational. The so-called boss might control money, territory, or operations, but legitimacy flowed from somewhere deeper and older. It flowed from kinship, from elders who no longer needed to prove anything, from women whose authority was invisible to outsiders but absolute inside the home, from relatives whose approval carried moral weight that no threat or promotion could replace. Executions, in this context, were not approved because someone held a position. They were approved because someone belonged to the bloodline. This is where many outsiders misunderstand the mechanics of power. They assume leadership is vertical, rigid, and formal. But in these families, leadership is relational. A younger boss may command men on the street, but he still lowers his voice at the table. He may give orders publicly, but privately he listens. And when it comes to irreversible decisions, death among them, His authority often pauses, waiting for a signal from someone who will never appear in an organizational chart. Documentaries and court testimonies have repeatedly shown that mothers, uncles, aunts, and older siblings played decisive roles at critical moments, not by shouting orders, but by framing reality. A mother might speak of danger not as strategy, but as fear for the family's future. An uncle might remind everyone of past betrayals, not to inflame, but to educate. A wife might question hesitation, not by demanding action, but by suggesting weakness. In these moments, the execution is no longer about control of territory. It becomes about survival of the family unit, and that reframing changes everything. Once a decision is framed as a family matter, refusing it becomes nearly impossible. Disagreement is no longer strategic, it is personal. Saying no does not mean opposing an order. It means questioning the judgment of your own blood. It means implying that the people who raised you, protected you, or legitimized your power are wrong. In environments where loyalty is the highest currency, this is more dangerous than any external enemy. This is why rank fails as an explanation for violence. The person who pulls the trigger may report to a boss. The boss may appear to authorize the act. But the psychological permission often comes from somewhere else entirely, from a look exchanged at dinner, from a phrase like, "We can't let this keep happening," from a quiet reminder of what happens to families that hesitate. By the time the act occurs, the boss is not acting as a leader. He is acting as a representative of family consensus. And consensus, once reached within blood ties, carries a unique form of authority. It feels inevitable, natural, even righteous. Executions authorized this way are not experienced internally as crimes, but as corrections, as maintenance, as a necessary adjustment to preserve balance. This is what makes them so difficult to stop. You are not fighting ambition, you are fighting tradition. You are not confronting a man, you are confronting a lineage. There are cases where bosses attempted to resist these pressures. Documentaries recount moments when leaders delayed decisions, hoping problems would resolve themselves. But delay is interpreted differently inside the family. It is read as uncertainty, as softness, as failure to protect what was entrusted to you. And once that perception takes root, the leader's position itself becomes unstable. In these systems, power is not only exercised downward, it is constantly evaluated inward. A boss who refuses a family-sanctioned execution risks becoming the problem discussed at the next table. This dynamic explains why executions often continue even after leadership changes. Arrests, assassinations, or power shifts on the street do not dismantle the table. The family remains. The logic remains. New leaders inherit not just territory, but expectations. They learn quickly that authority is conditional. You are powerful as long as you align with the family's sense of order. The moment you don't, your rank offers no protection. Another uncomfortable reality emerges here. Responsibility becomes emotionally outsourced. The boss may later claim he had no choice, and from his perspective, that may feel true. The decision was shaped long before it reached him. By the time it surfaced as an action, it was already framed as unavoidable. This does not absolve guilt, but it explains how violence perpetuates itself without constant direction from a single tyrant. This system also explains why eliminating leaders rarely dismantles organizations rooted in family power. Remove the boss, and the structure absorbs the loss. The table continues. Elders advise, younger members adapt. Executions still occur, authorized not by a crown, but by consensus reinforced through blood and memory. The visible head is replaceable. The invisible authority is not. Understanding this forces a re-evaluation of how we talk about responsibility. If executions are authorized by family consensus rather than formal command, then accountability becomes diffuse by design. Everyone participates just enough to feel invested, but not enough to feel solely responsible. The boss becomes a symbol, useful for outsiders who need a name, but internally he is only one voice among several that matter more. In the end, the most powerful figure in the room is often the one who never raises their voice, never appears in public, and never gives a direct order. Their power lies in shaping what is considered acceptable, necessary, or inevitable. They do not say, "Kill him." They say, "We've already lost too much." And once that sentence is spoken, the outcome is quietly sealed. What makes the family table endure is not just authority, but shared silence. By the time executions occur, responsibility has already been diluted so thoroughly that no single person can be isolated without unraveling the entire structure. This is not an accident, it is the design. Inside these families, silence is not the absence of speech, it is a form of participation. And once silence becomes normalized, everyone present becomes part of the decision, whether they speak or not. At the table, conversations rarely conclude with a clear resolution. They trail off. They pause. Someone changes the subject. Someone else pours another drink. To an outsider, it might look like indecision. In reality, it is closure. The lack of objection is interpreted as agreement. The absence of resistance becomes permission. Over time, this ritual teaches everyone involved that morality is not determined by personal conviction, but by collective tolerance. If no one stops the conversation, then the conversation has already gone far enough. This is how collective responsibility is constructed, not through explicit consensus, but through mutual awareness. Everyone knows what is being discussed, everyone understands where the logic leads, and everyone recognizes that speaking up would isolate them. Silence, therefore, becomes the safest position. It protects relationships, preserves access to power, and avoids becoming the next topic of concern. In this environment, morality is not erased. It is compartmentalized, stored away for a time when survival feels less urgent. Documentaries and testimonies often reveal the same haunting pattern after an execution: shock mixed with familiarity. Family members express sadness, sometimes even regret, but rarely surprise. "We knew it was coming," they say. This phrase is more revealing than it appears. Knowing without acting is not neutrality. It is a form of acceptance that allows violence to proceed without resistance. Over time, this knowing becomes heavier than action itself because it implicates everyone equally while condemning no one individually. Children raised in these environments absorb this logic early. They learn not to ask direct questions. They learn that certain names cause conversations to stop. They learn which absences should not be acknowledged. Most importantly, they learn that safety depends on reading the room correctly. Speaking at the wrong moment can carry consequences far more severe than staying silent during injustice. In this way, silence becomes hereditary. It is passed down not through instruction, but through observation and repetition. As these children grow into adults, silence evolves from instinct into strategy. They understand that participation does not require action, only alignment. Being present at the table, hearing the conversation, and choosing not to object becomes a signal of loyalty. And loyalty, once proven, offers protection. This is how entire families become entangled in decisions they never explicitly made, yet never opposed. The execution becomes a shared burden, carried quietly by everyone who remained seated. This shared burden creates a powerful psychological shield. When everyone is involved, no one feels uniquely responsible. Guilt is spread thin, like a stain diluted with water, until it is barely visible. This does not eliminate remorse, but it makes it manageable. It allows people to continue living, raising children, attending celebrations, while carrying the knowledge that they were present when a life was effectively signed away. The table makes this possible by transforming moral failure into collective necessity. The language used in these moments is crucial. Executions are never framed as acts of cruelty. They are framed as responses, corrections, endings to problems that have gone on too long. This framing is repeated often enough that it becomes internalized. Once violence is understood as maintenance rather than transgression, silence becomes easier. You are not allowing something wrong to happen. You are allowing something unpleasant but required. This distinction is what keeps the system intact. Over time, silence reshapes relationships within the family. Trust is no longer based on honesty but on discretion. The most valued trait is not courage, but reliability. Specifically, the reliability of not speaking. Those who master this are rewarded with proximity to power. Those who struggle are gradually excluded from conversations, then from decisions, and eventually from protection. Silence, in this way, becomes both currency and weapon. The tragic irony is that this system produces deep internal fractures. Many family members live with unresolved guilt, anxiety, and fear, even as they outwardly conform. Documentaries often capture these moments in interviews, pauses before answers, eyes looking away, voices tightening when certain topics arise. These are the cracks beneath the surface. The table may function smoothly, but the people around it are often deeply conflicted. They have learned to survive by not acknowledging what they know. Yet, acknowledging would change nothing, or so they believe. Speaking out would not undo past executions. It would only expose the speaker to retaliation or exile. This belief reinforces silence, turning it into a self-perpetuating loop. The more executions occur, the harder it becomes to speak. The more silence accumulates, the more normalized the violence becomes. Responsibility dissolves into history, and history becomes justification. In this way, the family table does more than authorize executions. It creates a moral environment in which those executions feel inevitable. No single person needs to push the button, because everyone has already agreed not to stop it. The decision exists everywhere and nowhere at once, impossible to trace and impossible to escape. And when outsiders ask the inevitable question, "Who knew?" the answer is always the same. Everyone knew, and that knowledge, shared and unspoken, is what made the execution possible in the first place. The most effective orders are the ones that are never given. In the world shaped by the family table, explicit commands are a liability. They create witnesses, memory, accountability. What replaces them is something far more efficient: signals. A pause held slightly too long, a sentence repeated with different emphasis, a question asked when everyone already knows the answer. These are not accidents of communication. They are the operating system. At the table, language is stripped down to its essentials. Directness is avoided not out of politeness but strategy. Saying "he needs to be dealt with" is safer than saying "he needs to die." Saying "this can't continue" is safer than naming consequences. The ambiguity is intentional. It allows every listener to arrive at the same conclusion while preserving the illusion that no conclusion was forced. The decision becomes something everyone discovered independently, rather than something imposed. This is how executions occur without orders. The work is done before anyone leaves the room. By the time action is taken, the instruction feels less like a command and more like a logical outcome. Enforcers later describe it not as receiving orders, but as understanding expectations. That distinction matters. An order can be questioned, delayed, or refused. An expectation feels embedded in reality itself. Signals function because everyone at the table has been trained to read them. This training is informal, cumulative, and relentless. Over years, family members learn which phrases carry weight and which are harmless. They learn that when certain topics resurface repeatedly, patience has expired. They learn that silence following a specific remark is not uncertainty, but confirmation. By the time someone acts, there is no confusion about intent. The message has already been delivered, quietly, collectively, and without trace. This system creates an extraordinary layer of deniability. If questioned later, everyone involved can truthfully claim they never ordered anything. There was no instruction, no directive, no moment where someone crossed a visible line. The decision lived in implication, and implication by its nature cannot be prosecuted. This is why investigators often describe these structures as ghost hierarchies. Power exists, but it leaves no fingerprints. Documentaries and court records reveal how consistently this method appears across cultures and decades. Different languages, different traditions, same mechanics. A leader asks whether a problem has been resolved. Someone replies that it hasn't. The leader nods, dissatisfied, and moves on. No command is issued, but everyone understands what dissatisfaction means in this context. The execution that follows is not disobedience, it is compliance. What makes this even more insidious is how responsibility is psychologically transferred. The person who ultimately carries out the act often feels less culpable because they were never explicitly told to do it. They weren't ordered, they inferred. This inference allows them to see themselves not as decision-makers, but as executors of an already decided reality. Guilt shifts upward and outward, diffused among everyone who participated in the signaling process. Signals also serve to test loyalty. If someone fails to act after a clear signal, that failure is noted, not publicly but internally. It becomes part of the unspoken record. Hesitation is interpreted as reluctance, reluctance as weakness, and weakness in these systems is dangerous. The absence of action becomes its own kind of signal, one that may be discussed at the next table. This is how the table maintains discipline without issuing threats. No one needs to say what happens to those who hesitate. Everyone already knows. The system runs on precedent, memory, and fear, not enforcement. Signals allow power to remain flexible, adaptive, and invisible, adjusting to circumstances without ever revealing itself fully. The language of signals also protects the family from internal fracture. Direct commands force confrontation. Signals preserve harmony. They allow everyone to believe they arrived at the same conclusion naturally. This illusion of unity is critical. It reinforces the idea that the family moves as one, that no one is coerced, that violence is not imposed but agreed upon. Even those who are deeply uncomfortable can tell themselves they were simply carried along by circumstance. In some cases, signals are so subtle that only certain people are meant to receive them. A phrase directed at one individual may sound harmless to another. A glance exchanged between two elders may carry meaning invisible to younger members. This selective communication ensures that knowledge is compartmentalized. Not everyone knows everything, and that ignorance provides further insulation from accountability. Yet the system is not without cost. The constant need to interpret signals creates an atmosphere of paranoia and hypervigilance. People listen more than they speak. They analyze tone, timing, and omission. Conversations become exercises in decoding rather than dialogue. Trust erodes, replaced by strategic listening. Everyone is alert, not just to threats from outside, but to shifts within the room. This environment shapes behavior far beyond moments of violence. Decisions about business, alliances, even marriages are influenced by the same signaling logic. Direct refusals are rare. Disapproval is implied. Consent is suggested. The table becomes a space where nothing is ever fully stated, yet everything is understood. This ambiguity is not confusion. It is control. When executions occur under this system, they often shock outsiders precisely because no warning signs are visible. There were no threats, no public disputes, no declarations of intent. The decision was invisible because it was never articulated in a way outsiders recognize. But for those inside the system, the outcome was clear long before it happened. The signals had been received, interpreted, and acted upon. In the aftermath, the same ambiguity that enabled the execution protects the table. No one can be singled out. No one can be definitively blamed. Each participant can claim they misunderstood or that they assumed someone else would intervene. The truth is more uncomfortable. Everyone understood enough to stay silent, and that was sufficient. The family table does not need orders to function. It needs alignment. Signals create that alignment without exposure. They allow power to move quietly, efficiently, and with devastating effect. And as long as decisions can be made without being spoken, the system remains intact, untouchable, untraceable, and deadly. Power systems built on blood eventually face their most brutal test. What happens when loyalty and threat occupy the same body? For families that authorize executions through consensus and silence, violence directed outward is only part of the story. The true measure of control is revealed when the table turns inward, when the person discussed is no longer an outsider, a rival, or a liability from another group, but one of their own. These moments are rarely sudden. They begin with discomfort. A relative who speaks too much, a cousin who draws unnecessary attention, a brother-in-law who acts independently. At first, these behaviors are tolerated, excused, reframed as temporary. But once a family-based power system has learned to resolve threats through irreversible means, tolerance has a limit. And when that limit is crossed, blood ties do not protect. They intensify the logic of discipline. At the table, these discussions are the most carefully coded of all. Names are avoided. Relationships are referenced indirectly. Someone might mention people forgetting where they come from. Another might question whether family still means what it used to. These phrases carry enormous weight. They signal that loyalty itself is under review. And in these systems, loyalty is not emotional, it is operational. You are loyal if your existence reinforces the structure. The moment it doesn't, your position becomes unstable. Documentaries that have reconstructed these cases reveal a chilling pattern. Once a family member is perceived as a risk, the same mechanisms used against outsiders are activated, but with greater urgency. Because betrayal from within is seen as more dangerous than any external threat. Outsiders can be fought. Insiders can unravel everything. The table understands this instinctively. Preserving authority means proving that no one is exempt. This is where the myth of unconditional family loyalty collapses. In these structures, loyalty is conditional on usefulness and discretion. Blood grants access, not immunity. In fact, blood makes discipline more symbolic. An execution approved against a relative sends a message stronger than any warning delivered to an outsider. It says, the rules apply to everyone, and more importantly, they apply first at home. For those present at the table, these decisions carry a unique psychological weight. The usual moral distancing becomes harder. You cannot frame the act as purely strategic when the person involved shares your last name. Yet, the system adapts. Language shifts again. The act is framed not as punishment but as necessity. Not as betrayal, but as preservation. The family convinces itself that removing one member saves the rest. This logic transforms violence into sacrifice. The individual tasked with carrying out such an act often experiences profound internal conflict. Documentaries capture this through fragmented testimonies, sleepless nights, hesitation, moments of doubt that surface only years later. But hesitation does not stop the process. It only makes it quieter. Once the table has aligned, the emotional cost becomes irrelevant. The system prioritizes survival over conscience, continuity over compassion. These moments also reinforce the authority of the table itself. By approving violence against one of its own, the family demonstrates that power does not belong to any single person. It belongs to the structure. This discourages dissent more effectively than fear alone. If blood cannot protect you, nothing can. And if nothing can protect you, obedience becomes instinctive. What follows is often a period of intensified silence. Family gatherings continue, but the absence is felt. Chairs remain empty. Certain topics vanish from conversation. Children sense the shift without explanation. They learn through omission that some stories are dangerous to remember. In this way, the execution becomes part of the family's internal mythology, a lesson never spoken but never forgotten. These internal purges also stabilize leadership. Any doubts about who truly holds authority are erased. The table proves its supremacy by acting against its own interests in the short term to protect itself in the long term. The loss of a capable relative is accepted as collateral damage. Power once again prioritizes structure over individuals, yet the cost is cumulative. Each internal execution erodes trust further. Family members become more guarded, more cautious. Love becomes conditional, filtered through usefulness and silence. The table continues to function, but the emotional bonds that once sustained it weaken. What remains is a family in form, but an institution in function. This erosion is rarely acknowledged. To do so would expose the fragility beneath the authority. Instead, the system doubles down. Traditions are emphasized. Loyalty is praised. History is rewritten to justify the loss. The narrative becomes one of inevitability. It had to happen. There was no choice. This narrative allows those who remain to continue living within the structure without confronting its cruelty directly. From the outside, these events are often misunderstood as acts of paranoia or internal chaos. In reality, they are expressions of extreme order. They demonstrate how far the system is willing to go to preserve itself. Violence against outsiders maintains boundaries. Violence against insiders enforces belief. By the time a family turns on its own, the table has already become something else entirely. It is no longer a place of shared meals or collective memory. It is a mechanism of control that consumes even those who built it. And still it persists, because fear, once internalized, does not require constant reinforcement. One internal execution can sustain obedience for a generation. After the decisions are made, after the signals are read, after the executions are carried out, the table remains. That is perhaps the most unsettling truth of all. The structure survives not because it is just, but because it is efficient. Chairs are rearranged, absences are absorbed, conversations resume. From the outside, it looks like continuity. From within, it feels like something else entirely, a quiet reckoning that never fully arrives. The empty chair becomes the final witness. It does not speak, but it is noticed. Even when no one acknowledges it, its presence changes the atmosphere. Meals are shorter. Laughter comes later, if at all. Certain jokes are no longer told. Certain memories are no longer shared. The family adapts, but it does not heal. Healing would require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would threaten the very logic that allowed the execution to happen. In families shaped by this system, consequences are not processed, they are inherited. Children grow up sensing that something is wrong without being told what it is. They learn which questions are unsafe, they notice which names are never spoken. Over time, they absorb the lesson that survival depends on selective memory. Forgetting becomes a form of loyalty. Remembering becomes a risk. This is how the table extends its power beyond the moment of violence. It shapes identity. It teaches future generations how to exist within the structure without challenging it. The execution may be over, but its influence is ongoing, diffused across years, shaping behavior long after the act itself has faded into rumor. The chair remains empty, but its lesson is full. Those who authorize the act, directly or indirectly, often live with a quiet contradiction. Publicly, they continue their roles. Privately, they negotiate with themselves. Some justify, some compartmentalize, some convince themselves that responsibility belongs elsewhere. The collective nature of the decision makes this easier. If everyone participated, then no one feels singularly accountable. Guilt becomes shared, and shared guilt loses its edge. Yet it never disappears entirely. Documentaries often capture this in subtle ways. A pause before an answer, a change in tone when the past is mentioned, a visible tension when the subject drifts too close to the truth. These moments reveal that the system's greatest strength, its ability to diffuse responsibility, is also its quietest weakness. No one escapes unmarked. The table also reshapes how power is understood by those who remain. Authority is no longer associated with protection, but with endurance. The strongest figures are not the most compassionate or decisive, but the most adaptable. They learn how to live with the knowledge of what has been done without being undone by it. In this way, power becomes less about control over others and more about control over oneself, specifically control over doubt. This internal discipline ensures the system's longevity. Even as external pressures mount, law enforcement, rival groups, public exposure, the table persists. Leaders come and go, structures evolve, but the underlying logic remains unchanged. Decisions are still made indirectly, responsibility is still shared, silence is still rewarded. The empty chair becomes part of the scenery. From the outside, observers often ask the wrong question. They ask who ordered the execution. The more difficult question is who continues to live with it, because survival within this system is not passive. It requires ongoing participation in the narrative that justified the act. It requires silence when memory resurfaces. It requires acceptance that some truths are incompatible with belonging. This is where innocence becomes impossible to define. Those at the table may not have pulled the trigger, they may not have spoken the decisive words, but they remain beneficiaries of the outcome. Their safety, their position, their continuity were preserved through the removal of another. This does not make them monsters, but it does make them implicated. And implication, once internalized, changes how a person sees the world. The empty chair also functions as a warning. It reminds everyone present that absence is not random. It teaches that membership is conditional, that belonging is sustained through alignment, not affection. In this way, the chair polices the room more effectively than any spoken threat ever could. Its silence is instructional. Over time, the table itself becomes hollowed out. What once may have been a genuine family gathering transforms into a ritual of maintenance. Meals are shared, but trust is not. Stories are told, but selectively. The structure survives, but intimacy erodes. Power remains, but warmth does not. This is the hidden cost of a system that prioritizes survival over humanity. And yet, the table endures because alternatives feel unthinkable. To dismantle it would require confronting the past openly, assigning responsibility clearly, and accepting consequences collectively. For families built on silence, this is more dangerous than any external threat. Exposure would collapse the moral architecture that keeps everyone in place. It would force a reckoning the system was designed to avoid. So the table stays, the chair remains empty, life goes on, and when outsiders return to the original question, who authorized the executions, they search for a name, a face, a signature. But the truth resists simplicity. The authorization did not come from a single person. It came from a structure that taught everyone present how not to object, how not to intervene, how not to see themselves as responsible. The most honest answer is also the most unsettling one. Everyone authorized it a little, through silence, through agreement, through the decision to remain seated. And that is the hidden power of the